Fan of Tim's games before you ever even came here. What was that experience like?
Well, so I was a big gamer when I was a kid, but like adventure games were always kind of special to me in particular. I think it was just, they had really rich stories and characters, right? It's like you would have these experiences playing through them that you wouldn't through other games. And I think also like, I knew from pretty early on when I got into games that like it was something that I wanted to do. Like I wanted to make games, and adventure games are great because they have this really strong creative voice, right? Like you can really see the people who made it and the experience. And I think that Tim's games are kind of the literal embodiment of that, right? Like things like Full Throttle and Grim Fandango are just like so far out of the normal realm of what games usually are, or even really like. I can't think of many settings in other media that are like, the sort of film noir world of skeletons, passing their time in the land of the dead, right?
I only have one other message for you, Manny.
I'm not your secretary. I don't take your messages. So get it through your thick skull and stop forwarding your phone to me.
It was so expansive and exciting. It was like, every time there was a new adventure game coming down the pipe, it was like, there's like a whole new world to explore. They were just always the games that I was most excited about. I loved other games as well, and so like as adventure games kind of faded into the distance, it was sort of like, okay, well, I guess you can sort of understand that like technology improves, so like more systemically motivated games like were easier to make and could do really interesting things, right? Like, and so it was like, well, I still love games and I still want to work in game development, but. I sort of realized at some point that like, oh well, I could still work with the people who like that's the thing that's important to them, right? Like having strong creative voice and like rich characters and great stories and all that kind of stuff. And so in the earliest days, I was more of a console gamer than anything because it was just sort of easier access to those things. So like my Game Boy was my lifeline, right? Like I had one of those like big packs that was like you sit the Game Boy in it and then you have like all of like hundreds of games just sort of stuffed into little pockets and things in the corners of it. But as far as PC games go, once I finally got some hardware, right? Like it was. And once the internet came around, there was tons of shareware being downloaded and that kind of thing. But the ones that I was always probably most excited about were, well, I guess LucasArts games specifically, right? Like I was a big Dark Forces fan. They used to sell those adventure packs that were like, would have a bunch of CDs for like reissues of the older games and some of the newer ones and those kind of things. And those were just like, opening a treasure chest, right? It's like, you'd buy one of those things and you'd have all these games to play and, some of which I already had or whatever. But like, when you don't have access to a lot of information about what's out there, like, and you get the games that are like so diverse and so interesting, like those were always awesome. I think that's what felt special about it. And it's like, I moved pretty quickly. And well, I was kind of always an omnivore. I always wanted to play both. But like as soon as I was able to scrape together some money, mowing lawns or whatever, right? Like it was usually to the goal of like getting some more PC hardware parts so that I could build a box to run some of the cooler games. They were just so dramatically different from the stuff that I was used to playing, where it's like if it's just Mario's there's not a lot of narrative depth there, right? Like there's something about a plumber and mushrooms and a princess, right? Like it's like if you look at the SNES era, right? Like I have a lot of fond memories about like JRPGs and things from that period that were kind of telling stories that were interesting to me at the time, right? But like there's very much a routine in those games. Like there's a specific style of narrative delivery that exists, and I was a big fan of those games, but it seemed like adventure games were just like so much broader, right? Like and had so much more opportunity to just like do something wacky, right? At any point in the narrative. So it was just you go like choose every text option that you can, not because like you're trying to solve the puzzle, but just because you want to hear everything that character has to say, right? You try and use every object with every other object, because even if it doesn't work, like maybe they wrote a funny line about that interaction or something. It was just so much more, I don't know, content than something like an RPG where it's like, okay, well, I guess I'll level up some more to get the next little tidbit of story so I can kind of keep that cycle going.
How early did you start getting into actually programming things?
So I got started programming really early. It actually wasn't at home. My mother worked for a state representative in Texas politics, and there was a 286 squared away in the corner that was for running some spreadsheet program or something. And after school, I would go over to her office to work, and it was DOS was installed and QBasic was there, and so I would make my own little text adventure games. They just super simple. It was always you would either get a textual description of the room that you were in, or I would make some crappy ASCII art and a bunch of print statements. And then you would always have 3 options, 2 of which would usually kill you, right? And then that was pretty much the nature of it. Those were my earliest programming experiences.
Yeah. At what point did you hardcore settle into doing programming as a profession? Was that always what it was, or?
So I was extremely lucky. I was into programming from a very early age, and I had a close family friend who was a programmer. He worked at Texas Instruments at the time when I met him. That was great as a way to sort of get broader exposure to what it meant to actually be a programmer in the real world, right? The way that I got doubly lucky was that he was also a hardcore gamer, and his life dream was to go work at Blizzard, and he pulled that off. He got a job at Blizzard in the sort of pre-StarCraft era. I still have no idea how this happened, but I got an opportunity to go do an internship over there when I was 13, working in QA, and it was awesome, right? And I think their thought was, oh, this will be fun for him. He'll kind of get to see what game development's about. He'll figure out that it's harder than he thinks it is, right? And that there's a lot of sort of boring drudge work, but I think all it was doing there at the time was testing a French build of StarCraft or something like that to make sure it wasn't broken, right? But I was just thrilled, right? I got to meet all these amazing, not just sort of meet these really smart programmers who could give me some tips on what I needed to be looking into next to learn more, but amazing artists and designers and people who would sit around at lunch and have these just very detailed, elaborate, thoughtful conversations about games. It was it was like another world, right? And so I sort of came out of that. With this hunger, right? It's I'd sort of always been interested in games and programming and thought that would be a fun career, but I was okay, well, this is I gotta, spend my nights and weekends trying to get better at this stuff so I can have a shot at doing this professionally. That same guy, actually, I was all excited because next year, next summer, I was going to be able to go out and do another internship at Blizzard, and I was really looking forward to it. And I got a call, it was 1 or 2 weeks before I was going to fly out there, and he's you can't do the internship. I just quit. I can't. And I was just devastated. But the reason that he had quit was that he and 2 other guys were going to found a new studio. So they moved up to Seattle and they opened up ArenaNet, which are the people who make Guild Wars. And so it wound up being, despite that soul-crushing moment, it was, instead I got to go up there and be an intern and actually do programming. And so that was amazing, right? They working on MMOs in particular is there's a lot of stuff that you have to on the server side and the client and all of the normal game programming stuff is just this huge world to try and grasp. And so I got to work with some really awesome people and they basically taught me how to program. And so I got trained by these fantastic people and would just come out every summer or if I had a long spring break or over the winter break for school. I was out there as often as I could be. Around the time I was in college was when Guild Wars was getting close to ramp, and so I took a year off to go work full time and do some server programming to get that out the door. And that was hugely rewarding. And I went back to school and did another year, and then they were like, well, do you want to come back full time right now? And it's well, it's already what I was going to do after college anyway, right? Might as well get a jump start on it. And so and then I spent many years working there. But I just had this really lucky opportunity to spend most of my childhood actually making progress on the thing that I was really passionate about doing professionally as an adult.
So how did you make the decision? How did you find yourself at Double Fine?
Well, so when I came back to work at ArenaNet full time, after the final year of college, the job that I held was I was the lead prototype programmer, and so essentially what my responsibility was to originally to kind of spearhead like new prototype technologies for like new server designs to make making MMOs easier, or like working on new tool chains to make the artists more efficient, to make like massive landscapes and that kind of stuff. And it was a really exciting job, and it was a lot of fun in the beginning because it was just sort of we had a lot of success with Guild Wars 1, and so we felt like we were on firm footing, and so we should do some technical exploration to come up with like the next big thing, right? So it was just whatever crazy ideas that we had for like cool new MMO features were something that I could work on. And so spent a lot of time doing that, but a lot of that work was kind of done in a vacuum. If you're not making a piece of technology for a specific game, it's really hard to evaluate like whether it's actually useful or not, right? It's hard to sort of direct the design of the thing because you can't ask yourself that simple question of like, will this make the game we're trying to make better? And so it evolved over time so that we were actually prototyping games, right? It's something that we kind of learned through that process. That process was very difficult. We went through a bunch of internal prototypes, which it's easy to sort of like, have your heart strongly attached to one. But when it's in a sense an experiment, right? It may die on the operating table. We kind of got to a point where the things that I cared about most were sort of like not in alignment with what the studio wanted to be doing holistically, and it was like, this prototyping stuff that we're doing is really cool, but like I just don't know if it's going to result in the kind of games that I'm personally really passionate about working on. And so it wound up being one of those things where it's like, well, if that's true, right, why am I here, and where else could I be where that would definitely be the case? And I think Double Fine in particular stood out to me, not just because I love their game so much, but because like the breadth of like creative risk taking that they're willing to take is really dramatic, right? The games are like so stylistically different from each other, and like mechanically different from each other, and like always with these weird settings with funny characters and all that kind of stuff. It just seemed like the embodiment of like that thing that I got really passionate about, right? Is like taking bold creative risks and just running with them all the way through to completion. I've worked on games that take 5 years to finish, right? And it's a hard process, right? Like now that I'm at Double Fine, I kind of wish I was here a lot earlier. But at the same time, like there's a part of me that's glad that like instead of working on Brutal Legend for 5 years, that like I get the opportunity to be around like all of these very creative games going on simultaneously. And honestly, like the shorter schedule like is just such a blessing, right? It's like you have to come up with what's the sort of like most constrained idea that you can come up with that's like fully realized by what you're able to implement in that period of time. It's such a great forcing function for like people doing creative work, and I kind of get more excited about those kinds of games just sort of as my personal tastes have evolved now than something that's like, okay, well this is a big epic production. It's like this RPG is going to take 60 hours to play through or whatever. I'd really like much rather consume a like 4-hour thing that's like really creative and interesting than something that's just sort of like bombastic and impressive. So yeah, like the new Double Fine has a lot of appeal to me.
Hey, what was it like when you came to apply to Double Fine? Like, what was the process like?
It was a little bit surprising, actually, because I'd done a lot of interviewing in the past for other companies, and sitting on the other side of the table, like, reviewing candidates, and like I had always sort of like personally when I would evaluate a technical applicant, it would be I would want to dive deep on some systems knowledge, or like have them solve hard problems on a whiteboard, or like just really kind of get into the nitty gritty. But like the Double Fine interview was not really that way. Like it was much more focused on. I already sent some code in as a code sample, so they kind of knew how it worked. So much of the interview was about personality, and talking about technical topics and making sure that the communication works and all that kind of stuff, and that you would make smart decisions. But it was not just sort of like hey, can you code, right? It was also like, can you work really well with the other disciplines, and are you good at managing yourself, and making smart decisions about what kind of things you work on. And then, are you someone who fits in with the culture of this company? It's like you interview, like, it wasn't just programmers, right? Like, it it was like a full day of like, cycling through a pretty substantial chunk of the company, right? And then finally, sort of Tim being the final bellwether to see whether or not he'd be okay with you coming and working at his company. I ended up at the end of the day being like, well, that was awesome. Like, I loved meeting all of those people. Do they actually know whether or not I'm a good programmer? Like, did they get the information they needed from me? And it mostly seemed like we were hanging around, kind of shooting the shit, having a good time. But they liked me, so they brought me on board. Yeah, so my code sample to Double Fine was I had re-implemented the Grim Fandango engine for XNA, which is Microsoft's like hobbyist programming, like C# based programming system for getting games on the Xbox. So it's like I have a version of Grim that more or less runs on the Xbox that I can never like show or release to anybody because there are potentially some legal issues surrounding that.
Looks like I got a message. It's some sort of special work order.
To all agents from Office Manager Don Copel.
All right, you boneheads, thank your lucky stars and get to your friggin' cars!
I mean, that was, I guess, actually one of the things that was cool to me is like, I'd been doing that kind of, I hadn't done a project that elaborate for an adventure game before that one. And honestly, I only did that one because it's my favorite game of all time. And it's like archaeology, right? It's like, when you're doing that, you're like trying to figure out all the data formats and like, you're trying to get the video playback to work. And when you do when you're decoding the sounds and like you get some of the like garbled speech to play sort of, right? But your algorithm's not really correct. So it's like you noodle on it some more until like you hear the perfect playback of that piece. And you're like, and then like, sort of disassembling the byte code for the game so that you get sort of like, basically how the scripting was laid out and you can see how they built the game, right? Like that was very exciting to me. And so like part of the reason that I was excited about the adventure game is like, I sort of know how to make an adventure game in reverse, right? Like by taking a finished one and peeling back the layers, but the idea of making one forward was, it's even better than that.
So that was just like your code sample that you sent in as part of the application process?
Well, I mean, I didn't make it for that. That would have been nuts. I mean, maybe it's a little bit nuts anyway. But actually, honestly, what happened was in my last job, I wound up managing a bunch of people and just didn't have the capacity to write code for work anymore. And there's a little part of me dies inside when I can't actually do that because it's important to me. It's sort of like a creative pursuit. And so like it was my hobby project on nights and weekends for probably a good year. Just sort of like noodling on it progressively and sort of trying to get it so that it was actually finishable and all the animations played back correctly and all that kind of stuff.
I mean, did you pay a lot of attention to work that people were doing with the emulation community to get that up and running?
Yeah, so there's another project out there called Residual, which is another complete implementation and I think they were a little bit smarter to work in public because if you survive in public long enough, then it makes any legal case against you harder to actually manifest. They had actually I had done mine implementation completely separately because writing it in C# was the only way for me to get it running on the Xbox, which is my end goal. The thing that was really nice is that while they were working on their implementation, like they were also sort of like reverse engineering some of the file formats. Like it has a really specialized video format that hasn't been used in many other games and that kind of thing. And so it's like they had a bunch of parallel work going on disassembling those formats and posting that information on the internet. And I was able to use that as the basis of converting some of that stuff. And I'm really glad that it exists because Grim's a really hard game to play in its native format today. I was ahead of them for a while, but by the power of open source programming, they're well ahead of me at this point, and they have the much nicer version. And it'll wind up on every platform, and people will be able to play that game until the end of time, which is great.
Stuck selling walking sticks to a bunch of burros for eternity.
What's the average day like? What are the type of things you have to work on?
There are two big things that I work on. The first are sort of our tool chain, and that's in some ways it's a support role. Like we have a bunch of tools that have already been written for the earlier games. They just sort of need ongoing support, and so it's like if there's some if there's some bug that somebody runs into, like, on the mailing, it goes out to the art bugs mailing list, and I'm usually one of the people who is first to respond to that and try and figure out what's going on. Every once in a while when I get a little bit of spare time, if there's some piece of UI that everybody in the company hates, I try and dive in there and make a slightly nicer version of it. But the other thing that I tend to do is work on, big systems that are technical risks for the game. Ron's project, it's a streaming world, right? And so it's all interconnected. And we had a system for a streaming world for Brutal Legend, but it was sort of designed for driving around this huge expansive terrain, which was not really appropriate for the thing we're making. So we had to knew we needed a new streaming system, and so I was the guy who went and built that and all of the tools for it. Typically my focus is not so much on the gameplay stuff, but more on the underlying systems that you need in place in order to do those things. I do a lot of platform work, so compatibility between PC and the consoles, or there will be a lot of it for this project, trying to get it to run on all those crazy Android phones and Linux and Mac and that kind of stuff. But really, it's just sort of all of the stuff that needs to go on to lay the groundwork for the rest of the game is my main area of focus.
Do you think it's a nice evolution of the genre?
It's going to be interesting and new, and it's kind of exciting to me. I would have been a little bit disappointed if instead what we were doing was sort of very old school, making re-envisioning of the games. I love those old games and I go back to play them quite a bit, right? But I don't know, I don't think we want to compete with our memories of the past, right? My own memories of those games are probably better than they are in actuality. Doing something new that excites everybody in the studio is it's a really talented crew of people, right? If the artists feel really, creatively engaged by the kind of work that they can do based on the style and all that kind of stuff. And Tim feels like he can design a game that has interesting mechanics and some of the discussions that have been going on about does the dialogue system need to be as traditional as a classic adventure game, or can we branch out and do some different things? I'm really glad that those are the kinds of discussions that we're having, right? Instead of just trying to repeat what already has been done.